Modern warfare is regarded as having begun in the late 19th century. Since then, many incredible machines of war have been built, though not all have stood the test of time. As technology advanced and military tactics adapted, things that were once seemingly ubiquitous in war became phased out entirely. Today we're going to be looking at some of these machines that have been rendered obsolete by the changing face of war. In 1850, the Napoleon became the world's first ever purpose-built steam battleship. It was designed as a ship of the line, as line battles were the prevailing tactic in naval combat at the time. In a line battle, each fleet of ships would line up side by side and then the two fleets would open fire on one another. Generally speaking, this meant that the heaviest ship carrying the largest guns had a significant advantage, and that was the philosophy behind the Napoleon. Like other contemporary ships, the base construction of the Napoleon was wood, but it had the added advantage of reinforcing many sections of the hull with iron plating. Naturally, this armor provided significant protection against incoming gunfire. Thanks to the combination of the iron armor and a regiment of 90 guns, the Napoleon changed the shape of naval warfare. From that moment on, ironclad battleships became a staple of navies all around the world. Then, in 1906, Britain's HMS Dreadnought ushered in the modern era of battleships. The Dreadnought was faster, had heavier armor focused on the most vital areas, and more importantly, had more firepower. Until that point, battleships used a variety of different calibers of guns. This was practical for a time, as the smaller guns were more maneuverable. But the increasing range of torpedoes forced ships to engage in combat from progressively further away. That meant the smaller, shorter range guns were becoming pretty useless. Recognizing this, the designers of the Dreadnought abandoned the tactic of using a variety of calibers, instead making it the first all-big gun battleship. This change gave the Dreadnought more firepower over a longer range, and it seemed that these new, heavier battleships were going to be the future for a long time to come. But that didn't happen, and the beginning of their decline started very quickly. In 1918, the HMS Hermes was laid down. It was the world's first purpose-designed aircraft carrier, and it was going to change the face of naval combat far more than a battleship ever had. While battleships were massively powerful with increasingly long-range guns, they were also extremely heavy and slow. The Dreadnought may have been an innovation in battleship speed, but they were still slow compared to other naval ships. More importantly, they were extremely slow compared to airplanes. These made them easy targets, as an aircraft carrier could park itself outside of a battleship's firing range and then just launch its planes to take out the battleship. The change that aircraft carriers brought to warfare was dramatic, and the number of battleships in use quickly fell. Over 250 battleships were deployed during World War I, but in World War II, that number dropped to below 100. In addition to being rendered essentially obsolete by aircraft carriers, battleships weren't useful for new naval tactics. Speed had become a priority, making destroyers and cruisers the ships of choice over their much bulkier counterparts. Battleship use decreased dramatically, and the last time they saw naval combat was by the US Navy during the Gulf War in 1991. The USS Missouri is generally regarded as the last battleship to be decommissioned, which was done in 1992. A few years later, two other battleships were reactivated before being decommissioned again in 2005, but since no battleship has fired its guns in combat since 1991, the decommissioning of the Missouri was the final death of the battleship. Before we continue with today's video, I want to ask you, have you ever Googled yourself and got a bit of a cringe-worthy surprise that your personal info is plastered across a random website? Well, fear not, because our incredible sponsor today is Aura, and they are here to save the day. Look, there's an invasion of privacy going on out there, but thanks to Aura, those sneaky data brokers won't get away with it anymore. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Aura does more than just play superhero against data brokers, though. It's your one-stop shop for online protection. Say goodbye to robocalls, spammers, and invisible threats lurking on the internet. Setting up Aura gives you parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, all in one place, and it's super affordable. Aura takes the hassle out of keeping your online life safe so you can focus on what really matters, like binge watching your favorite TV shows. So look, here's the deal. You can either let people profit off your info, or you can join Aura. Head over to aura.com/sideprojects and start your 2-week free trial, and let Aura be your online superhero. Thanks to Aura for sponsoring today's video, and now back to it. Trenches have been used in war at least as far back as ancient Rome, but nothing is more synonymous with trench warfare than World War I. Standoffs in the trenches could last for months, and the need for an effective way to push past the enemy's defenses led to the creation of the tank. The British introduced their Mark I, the world's first ever tank, which was designed to break through German trenches and drive past barbed wire. As other specialized tanks were introduced, these initial designs were categorized as heavy tanks. However, this distinction wasn't actually based on their weight, but rather on their their role. Heavy tanks were slow and had poor maneuverability, but in exchange they were heavily armored and had incredible firepower. Not only were these tanks used to break through the trenches, but they were designed to roll alongside infantry, providing them cover from enemy fire as well as a psychological advantage over enemy troops. And with their large guns, they were of course also designed to fight other heavy tanks. While light, medium, heavy, and super heavy tanks all proved extremely effective at their specific tasks, they were also very much a product of their time. These specialized types of tanks weren't designed because specialization was the optimal solution for tanks, it was because it was the best solution given the limitations of technology at the time. But as the years went on, that was going to change. The idea of a universal tank came into being, and new tanks were designed in an attempt to fill that role. However, it was while the British Army's Chieftain tank was being developed in the 1950s that it became the first tank to receive the designation as a main battle tank. Once the main battle tank was created, it essentially rendered all other forms of tank obsolete. Main battle tanks combined the firepower of super heavy tanks, the armor of a heavy tank, and the speed and maneuverability of a light tank, all in the package of a medium tank. With advances in technology making such a machine possible, there was little need to build anything other than main battle tanks. Of course, it wasn't only technology for tanks that had improved, but technology for weaponry as well. As anti-tank artillery increased in effectiveness, the need for increased maneuverability became much more important. This seems to be a common theme throughout war, where raw, bulky power is repeatedly rendered ineffective by greater speed and maneuverability. Although main battle tanks immediately supplanted all other tanks, those other tanks still remained active for decades, either in smaller roles or after being sold off to less militarily advanced nations. The last known use of a heavy tank in combat was during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when the Iraqi army had a small regiment of Soviet IS-3 heavy tanks. In 1996, the last active heavy tank, a Soviet T-10M, was finally decommissioned. Railway guns were first proposed in 1847, though they weren't first used until 1862 during the American Civil War. Railway guns are also exactly what they sound like: a gigantic gun mounted to, transported by, and fired from a railway wagon. Basically, it was just a train with a big-ass gun or guns. The guns used were often Navy surplus arms that had been originally designed to be mounted on gigantic battleships, but sometimes they were specially designed for the railways. This innovative design brought with it a number of advantages. Because railway guns were able to use the existing rail lines, they were highly mobile and could be deployed wherever was needed. Before these were introduced, artillery of this size and power was only possible for use by Navy ships or from a fixed position like shoreline guns. Not only did this mobility give them flexibility, it also added an element of surprise. Railway guns could be moved to different locations quickly and had much longer ranges than traditional artillery, so their use could be impossible to predict. Of course, there were also some technical challenges that needed to be managed. Guns of this size were normally attached to ships weighing tens of thousands of tons, so firing them was not going to be an issue. But when artillery of that size was fired from a railway car, the recoil became an absolutely massive problem. Originally, the guns were in a fixed position, unable to rotate, so the recoil would just propel them directly backwards on the tracks. Even with the brakes on, firing one of these guns could cause the car to move up to 50 feet backwards. Once the ability to rotate and aim the guns was included, stabilizers and anchors had to be added to prevent the cars from tipping over after the gun was fired. Railway guns quickly rose in popularity during World War I, thanks in particular to France's shortage of traditional heavy field artillery. They initially repurposed coastal artillery for use as railway guns before producing dedicated artillery for that purpose. Once France started using them in the war, everybody wanted in on the action. Their use continued into World War II, with Germany producing the Schwere Gustav gun. The Schwere Gustav was the single largest caliber artillery rifle ever fired in combat, with shells 80 centimeters in diameter and having a range of 43 kilometers. However, this was also the last war in which railway guns would ever be used. They may have been extraordinarily powerful, but that power was accompanied by a whole host of problems. While being able to use pre-existing railroad tracks certainly made them appealing initially because of the mobility it provided, the existence of those tracks was obviously mandatory for the guns to be deployed. This meant that the guns would never reach rough terrain or undeveloped areas. They weren't suitable for use on existing tracks either, as some of the tracks just weren't built to support the weight of such a massive piece of artillery. But even if a location had the necessary tracks in place, they were easily disrupted. Tracks could be sabotaged by ground units, and both the tracks and the guns themselves required vulnerable to aerial attack. While the railway cars did have some amount of armor, the guns themselves were large, exposed targets. They were also very slow to reload, with the Schwerer Gustav only being able to fire once every 30 to 45 minutes. This left a large window of time where a railway gun could be attacked if it couldn't defend itself. As powerful as railway guns were, the costs simply began to outweigh the benefits. And with other, more mobile and reliable forms of heavy artillery having been developed, such as tanks, there was simply no need to continue using railway guns. But even if it was no longer practical, a train that is also the world's largest gun, it's still pretty cool. Whether it's the Hindenburg or the Goodyear blimp, you're almost certainly familiar with these types of airships. But before you start conjuring mental images of two blimps engaging in a dogfight like some sort of fighter planes, that's not really the role that blimps served in the military. These lighter-than-air aircraft served a number of military purposes, though they did not engage in aerial combat. While the blimps were often equipped with machine guns for self-defense, their preferred method of defense was to either steer clear of active combat zones entirely or to ascend to higher altitudes where it was difficult for enemy planes to give chase. The main purpose of these airships was for reconnaissance and surveillance, though they could be used for rescue missions if necessary as well. The ability to conduct reconnaissance was aided by the fact that blimps were still being used as a form of commercial passenger transportation. That benefit was combined with the lack of international treaties imposing strict rules on various types of subterfuge. Military blimps would frequently be disguised as civilian vehicles, sometimes having logos for non-existent companies painted on them to help sell the ruse. This allowed them to conduct surveillance missions without drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Blimps were used extensively throughout both world wars, but it wasn't all information gathering. They did have one specific combat duty, and that was to attack submarines. Most famous was the US Navy's K-class blimps, utilized through the duration of World War II. Each blimp was equipped with radar, sonar buoys, and equipment to detect magnetic anomalies. Once a submarine was located, the airships each were loaded with 4 160-kilogram depth charges that they could drop to attack the submarines. There aren't any hard numbers for how many, if any, submarines were directly destroyed by these blimp attacks, but it didn't matter. Even if the submarine wasn't sunk by the attack, the shockwave created by the depth charges and resulted in damage to the subs that could force them to the surface. Since the main advantage submarines had in naval combat was stealth, forcing them up from the depths of the ocean to the surface where they could be easily targeted was all the blimps needed to accomplish. Various airships and balloons have seen continued use by militaries as a means of surveillance, though these designs have strayed away from actual blimps. But as for their use as an anti-submarine combat vehicle, that ended shortly following World War II. Blimps are extremely slow compared to other aircraft, which made them incredibly easy for planes to intercept. Submarines also started becoming equipped with anti-aircraft missiles, so a blimp that merely forced a sub to the surface without destroying it would be a really easy target. But it wasn't just the subs that had improved technology. The capability of fixed-wing aircraft to locate and attack submarines had also improved dramatically, rendering blimps obsolete as a combat vehicle. The last K-class blimp was retired from active service by the Navy in 1959. Unlike all the other entries that we've talked about today, strategic nuclear missiles are the only ones that haven't necessarily been rendered obsolete by more advanced weaponry. The development of tactical nuclear weapons has made the use of strategic nukes far less likely, as tactical nukes are more precise and have lower yields, making them relatively safer for civilian populations near combat zones. Just remember that relatively here is compared to strategic nukes, and we're absolutely not claiming that tactical nuclear weapons are in any way safe. They absolutely aren't. Despite still being technologically relevant, strategic nuclear weapons were used twice back in 1945 and never again since. The answer for why they're no longer used is pretty simple. Everybody saw what happened the first time and that they were used. Unfortunately, we can't guarantee that that will last forever. While it is indeed true that strategic nuclear weapons are no longer used in wars, there's literally nothing that says they can't be used again, which, if you kind of think about, is really weird. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, and even lasers designed to blind people rather than kill them are all banned in war by international law, but no such ban exists on either strategic or tactical nuclear weapons. There are multiple international treaties regarding nuclear arms, but they focus on limiting development and preventing non-nuclear states from acquiring nuclear weapons from others. But for whatever reason, it wasn't considered necessary to ensure that the countries that already possessed nuclear weapons were actually never going to use them again. At any rate, it's currently true that strategic nuclear weapons are no longer used, and we really hope that it stays that way.